story. Boom. All right. So shortly after John Podesta's emails were hacked and posted to WikiLeaks in 2016, a really bizarre conspiracy theory began to crop up. Some users on sites like, alt-right users on sites like Twitter, 4chan, began to claim that they found in these emails coded references to a underground ring of child sex traffickers headed by the Democratic upper crust operating in local establishments. So, as a result, in March of that year, a man literally brought a rifle with him into a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. to demand answers. So, while this insane conspiracy theory, known today as Pizzagate, has long since been debunked, and I, like many, I'm sure, find it laughably absurd, there were some who didn't. There was one, in fact, who took it so seriously it was almost at the expense of human life. So the point I want to make here is that while Pizzagate may be the farthest thing from what most of us consider reality, that does not make it any less real. There were real-world consequences to what, for even most online proponents, thought a joke. No doubt this is paradigmatic of our time, this post-truth era. Paranoia seems to be the normal operating state for most of us. We must constantly be suspicious of what we see online, lest we fall prey to Russians or capitalists. The government is always up to something nefarious, or alternatively, the deep state has stymied them, and so on. Depending on your news sources, your friends, etc., truth takes on very different shapes, and doesn't always belong to someone else's reality. As such, paranoia can be a useful critical tool, as it reveals not the truth, but rather the systems of enforcement that engineer that truth and make it a reality. On many levels, this is what structures Thomas Pynchon's 1966 novel, The Crying of Lot 49. The book's many seemingly unmanageable plots seem to revolve around one focus: the protagonist Oedipa Maas's task of executing the will of her former lover and consummate capitalist Piers Inverarity. Though Oedipa has next to no idea how to perform this role, what confuses her most is why she has to in the first place. As such, she launches herself into an assessment of Inverarity's estate, only to be drawn further into uncomfortable mystery upon the discovery of a symbol, a muted post horn, and a word, Trastero, both of which seem inexplicably tied to Piers. Thus, in order to signify what she means to Inverarity, Oedipa theorizes that she first must understand herself in reference to Trastero, a project that defines the entirety of our narrative. However, the truth of Trastero is never attained, and as such, reader and Oedipa become paranoid, concerned that they never found a perspective outside their own that might confirm that their interpretive existence was not a wild goose chase without a quote point. Even as a scholar on this text, bent on discerning whatever recalcitrant point Pynchon seems to be making, even in absentia, there seems to be no academic consensus here. Not only are manifold conclusions reached, there is little consistency to the narrative and meta-narrative evidence used to reach these conclusions. So, the point I'd like to make here today will not be in arguing for or against any of these theories, but rather in agreeing with all of them. Like our conspiracy theory above, crafted by the same critically eye as a theorist, these theories don't need to be, quote, true for them to be believed. For as we will see, it is only with the understanding that interpretation itself is a narrative that we might understand The Crying of Lot 49, a narrative about interpretation. Simply put, the narrative of The Crying of Lot 49 takes on the form of a detective plot. While this point may seem unremarkable, it is crucial to observe that in a novel we know as postmodern, this establishes Oedipa's mode of interpretation strongly in line with modernist practices. Indeed, a shift in the status of interpretation is exactly what, according to Slavoj Žižek, delineates the movement from modernism into postmodernism. Whereas, if the pleasure of modernist interpretation consists in the effect of recognition, which gentrifies this disquieting uncanniness of its object, aha, now I see the point of this mess, the aim of the postmodernist treatment is to estrange this very initial homeliness. So, whereas a modernist work would employ some trauma, a shock to the system, as with Inverarity's death and Oedipa's newfound responsibility with regard to his will, that would thus engage interpretation, postmodernist work does the exact opposite. Interpretation becomes our shock. The gaps in our symbolic reference frame are revealed in the act of interpretation. So while the specific interpretive character of the crying of Lot 49 as text, not as narrative, will require further appraisal, it's safe to say that Pynchon has intentionally placed a modernist tale inside of a postmodernist framing, the reasons for which aren't immediately clear. As such, this should bring to mind a literary device that Pynchon uses quite frequently, known as mise en abyme. Mise en abyme, literally, to place into the abyss, is the action of placing a narrative within a larger narrative, so to mirror and reflect the framing narrative's thematic occupations. For example, in what may be the most iconic usage of mise en abyme, the mousetrap in Hamlet, Hamlet has staged a play that mirrors what he suspects happens to his father, murdered by his brother, and so to gauge his uncle Claudius's reaction for verification. Indeed, Claudius reacts, and this mise en abyme has become the site of this narrative's anagnoresis. Indeed, purely on the narrative, which I again remind is composed to modernist practices, the most prominent example of mise en abyme in The Crying of Lot 49, a play named The Courier's Tragedy that, astoundingly, takes up 10 pages of the novel's 152, seems to clarify for Oedipa, at least, why Pearson Verity may have named her the executor of his will, Tristero. Thus for Oedipa, and I emphasize only for Oedipa, The Courier's Tragedy seems to serve as the site of her anagnoresis. Though she had initially gone to the play to see its narrative elements that a band, not incidentally named the Paranoids, said were identical to some of Inverarity's holdings, a single line in the play that mentions Tristero changes everything. Oedipa thus begins her interpretive mission, the verification of Tristero, based on her interpretation that this was what Inverarity wanted her to discover. However, on the path that she supposes will lead to the verification of Tristero, paranoia begins to consume her as it seems increasingly inaccessible, so much so that she's almost driven insane. She nearly abandons this mission and the clues she had thus far assembled. However, before fully doing so, Oedipa learns new information that reignites this conspiracy in her mind. A mysterious man who very well may be part of Tristero has decided to turn up in person to the auction of Pearson Verity stamps, which themselves seem inexplicably linked to Tristero. Indeed, verifying that this man is a part of Tristero would in essence confirm that it has objective existence outside of Oedipa's mind. However, before this man ever appears, the novel ends. Remarkably, the novel's first employment of mise en abyme, the painting Bordando el Manto Terrestre by Remedios Varo, pictured here, prepared us for this narrative imbroglio. She had looked down at her feet and known then, because of a painting, that what she stood on had only been woven a couple thousand miles away in her tower, was only by accident known as Mexico, and so Pierce had taken her away from nothing. There'd been no escape. What did she so desire escape from? Such a captive maiden, having plenty of time to think, soon realizes that her tower, like her ego, its heightened architecture, are like her ego, only incidental. That what really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all. Having no apparatus except gut fear and female cunning to examine this formless magic, to understand how it works, she may fall back on superstition, take up a useful hobby like embroidery, go mad, or marry a disc jockey. If the tower is everywhere, and the night of deliverance no proof against this magic, what else? So Oedipa is clearly to be understood as one of these captive maidens. Her tower is, no doubt, the reality in which she lives. The magic, anonymous and malignant, that forces her to remain where she is, we later learn, is the void, a meaningless abyss. As she remarks, as the men who helped her build the theory of Tristero abandon her, she says, "They are stripping from me," feeling like a fluttering curtain very high in a window, moving up, then out over the abyss, clearly evocative of that previous picture here. Indeed, Oedipa seems fundamentally concerned with an escape from this tower of her own creation, a verification of her reality by reality, her truth as truth. But, like for Oedipa, truth is never confirmed as such for the reader. This night of deliverance, Tristero, never objectively appears, and as a result, all the reader and Oedipa are left with is paranoia. Indeed, it's as if Oedipa's paranoia had been foisted upon the reader, because a lack of narrative closure does not necessarily mean there is none. As such, the reader is sent on a detective mission of their own in trying to make sense of the novel, trying to resolve the disquiet of paranoid thinking. And so the reader turns from narrative clues with which Oedipus engaged to meta-narrative clues in an attempt to wrangle this meaning. However, here, the troubling presence of postmodernism comes into clear view. The very things that one may have initially expected to be the text's clues, for example, the names, puns, allegories used, in retrospect appear the very opposite. Instead of a release of signifying potential, a sort of comprehensive anagnorisis that might rationalize every gesture towards it for us, the text's peculiarities only seem to accrue multifarious, ergo unintelligible significance, a defining characteristic of paranoia. This is blatantly obvious in, for example, the most important name of the novel, Oedipus. Oedipus, whose name is unmistakably similar to Sophocles' Oedipus, the iconic riddle solver of Greek tragedy, and simultaneously Freud's Oedipal complex that is one of the most seminal works of modernity. Of course, the first incongruity among many to these metaphors comes with the fact that Oedipus is female, and both Sophocles and Freud used males as their subjects. A gentle refutation of not only these two narratives, but furthermore, a reversal of traditional modernist form where, more often than not, the protagonist was male. The issue is the same with the other major character in the novel, Pearson Verity. Not only does his last name, Inverarity, seem like the word inveracity, untruthfulness, his name is also evocative of C.S. Peirce, the founder of American semiotics, semiotics being the process by which truth is made. So, depending on how one interprets these names, and indeed all these narrative elements, their significance appears radically different. This, no doubt, is evocative of Oedipus' ruminations on metaphor. The act of metaphor, then, was a thrust at truth and a lie, depending where you were, inside safe or outside lost. Oedipus didn't know where she was. So let us, for a moment, take this in reference to our Pizzagate rifleman, the metaphor being the child sex trafficking ring, right? So for those of us outside of the metaphor, those of us whose sources of information are not exclusively alt-right, Twitter, and 4chan, indeed, Pizzagate's a lie. The metaphor is lost on us. However, for the rifleman, it's clearly a thrust at truth. His interpretation of the metaphor is safe because in his alt-right semantic web, all signs point to the conspiracy being a reality. The same as well might apply to Oedipus, meaning his conservative Trastero exists, or is at least believed to be so, but the opposite is true if it proves to be false. She is safe in her tower of individual interpretation, but lost without it. Is this not exactly what Randolph Driblet cautions her as she asks him about this play, The Curious Tragedy, and its mention of Trastero? You guys, you're like Puritans about the Bible, so hung up with words. Words. You know where that play exists, not in a file cabinet, not in any paperback you're looking for, but in here. That's what I'm here for, to give the spirit flesh. The reality is in this head mind. You can put together clues, develop a thesis or several about why the characters reacted to the Trastero possibility the way they did, why assassins came on, why the black costumes. You could waste your life that way and never touch the truth. Indeed, this seems to be the effect of Pynchon's mise en Abyme on the level of genre. Though postmodernist literature holds that truth does not exist, modernism argues the opposite, that it exists and can be found. And this, in a sense, is the dynamic antagonism animating the text, between the protagonist's belief that knowledge is possible and the author's belief that it isn't. Such a revelation thus informs our understanding of paranoia in the text. Like for Oedipus, paranoia for the reader is not so much an interpretive block, but rather an interpretive salve. Seeing as paranoia is not the absence of meaning, but rather an overwhelming presence thereof, we may understand why Pynchon has refused us a sense of closure in Oedipus' modernist narrative. It reveals to us our desire and indeed habit of meaning-making that is, like Oedipus, firmly within the modernist tradition. Indeed, one may even see here that Pynchon's use of mise en Abyme is a Brechtian staging of Aristotelian logos, but given my time constraints, I'm definitely not going to go into that. So indeed, the reader is driven to look for clues to the novel's meaning, so to resolve Oedipus and in turn their own paranoia, unaware that in doing so, they have recreated the same interpretive conditions that generated paranoia in the first place. As Freud himself admitted, the delusions of paranoiacs have an unpalatable external similarity and internal kinship to the systems of our philosophers. We, like Oedipus, subscribe to the modernist model of interpretation because the alternative, an abyss of radical meaninglessness, offers us no comfort, no direction with which to orient our lives. Indeed, this is exactly something Oedipus herself ultimately realizes when the men who had aided her in her quest are no longer interested in doing so. She stood between the public booth and the rented car in the night, her isolation complete, tried to face toward the sea. But she'd lost her bearings. She turned, pivoting on one stacked heel, could find no mountains either, as if there could be no barriers between herself and the rest of the land. Pearson Verarity was really dead. So clearly, not only has Oedipus' Tristero suspicions kept the memory of Inverarity alive in Oedipus, it gave her life and world meaning. Thus, it is no surprise that in the face of this, the novel ends where it does. Instead of abandoning her mission, Oedipus returns to her paranoid suspicions and travels to where she has put Inverarity's stamp collection up for auction, suspecting that a mysterious man who wants to buy them is a part of Tristero and finally will provide her with objective proof of his existence. So indeed, it is easier to think that everything is connected than thinking nothing is, that there is meaning to life and death as opposed to none. As such, the veracity of Tristero is not what we should see as important to the novel, but rather Oedipus' desire to verify it. Taking this understanding a step back, we may understand the same things for ourselves. Our scholarly focus should not be on the truth of our theorizations, but rather why we feel that truth exists in the first place. Thus, it is clear that through paranoia, Pynchon reveals that his narrative will offer no truth, and in doing so, shows that the perception of truth is nothing more than a narrative. Recall that Oedipus' mission was originally to discern why Inverarity named her the executor of his will, not to verify Tristero, but nonetheless, she tells herself that story so she can palliate the trauma of Inverarity's death. As Oedipus' psychoanalyst, Dr. Hilarious, tells her when she comes to him, quote, hoping he'd talk her out of a fantasy that is Tristero, he replies, cherish it. What else do any of you have? Hold it tightly by its little tentacle. Don't let those Freudians coax it away or the pharmacists poison it out of you. Whatever it is, hold it dear. For when you lose it, you go over by that much to the others. You begin to cease to be. Indeed, as Oedipus realizes, her tower is all she has, meaning no matter how unstable or even unverifiable is better than none at all. This is why, though she has remained critical of all the information she receives about Tristero, aware that it may all merely be from Inverarity and the functionaries of his estate, she nevertheless chooses to believe in it. Similarly, we may think of our Pizzagate rifleman whose hatred of Democrats gives his life purpose, if I may say so. Right? He, willingly or not, confines himself to the interpretations of alt-right Twitter and 4chan and what have you, because this hatred of Democrat, in any other context, makes no sense. As such, Pynchon has, at least in the reader, broken down the binary between fantasy and reality to show that though meaning does not exist innately and so cannot be found, it is not as though postmodernists claim that it doesn't exist at all. It is somewhere in the middle. It is created. And thus Pynchon shows that in this abyss of postmodern meaning, that is all we have, the tower of our own interpretations. Thank you.